I went on to study at Cornell and study abroad at Oxford. These are some of the best educational institutions in the world, and I can say without a doubt that the education I got in the great books was better than the education I got for $250,000. And I think the reason that is that we read books. How profound is that? Even in university-level philosophy courses, you're reading excerpts, you're reading paragraphs. You're not getting a real sense of what Mr. H taught was the great conversation. The sense that Western civilization began in ancient Greece, was transmitted to Rome, to medieval Christianity, through the Reformation, through the Enlightenment, to modernity, and then that in these various tracks of philosophy and history and literature and science and mathematics, that there's a set of responses. People are working with, people in ancient Rome, their education was to read the works of ancient Greece, and so on and so forth, and just built. So people were responding, they were standing on the shoulders of giants, to use Newton's phrase. And I felt that everything before I started the Great Books program and almost everything else that I did in my education was of very little value by comparison to having this structure, this framework for thinking about the world in which I live and how we got here and the ideas and the history that we were responding to. Original sources are powerful. I remember taking a graduate level course in history. I think we were studying Alexander the Great's campaigns and learning that, really having this experience that academia is this inverted pyramid. You have a very small set of original sources who are the people living at the time saying, this is important, I need to write this down, I need to record my thoughts about it. And then you have the people that come a generation later that comment on that. And then you have the people that comment on the commentators and the comment on the commentators of the commentators, and it builds up from that, and eventually it becomes completely pointless. Very dry, very boring stuff. But the stuff at the bottom is rich. I just had this sense while going through the great books that I had to respect the book I was reading because somebody took the time to write it and really cared. Whereas when you're reading a high school textbook, you feel like you're part of some system that is accredited, and somebody is being paid to write a book that compiles things, and there's no real sense of importance.
What I loved and what was significant about the great books for me was the fact that we'd get a text, an original text to read each week, and we'd have a week to come up with our own ideas and our own deductions from what we'd read to share. And I think that process challenged me a lot, not just as a student in the classroom, but as an individual, of what was significant or what was meaningful or what I could apply to my own perspective on life from what I was reading, and to be able to challenge myself to formulate arguments and to present them to my peers, as opposed to the AP classes or the high school classes that I would take, where you'd basically get a text that was so generic and overread that it had almost become cliche, and then you'd get a piece of paper and you'd answer questions, and the way you would mark your intelligence was how, like the others, your answers were, how you could get information and then just regurgitate it. And I'm a writer, I'm a singer-songwriter, and I remember coming across this quote relatively recently that says, you think your story of love and heartbreak is unprecedented in the history of the world, and then you read. And it's in those books that you realize that your story and your pain is what actually connects you to the rest of the world. And one thing that I've been so blessed by with GBT is that it really opened my eyes and my mind to the world of knowledge and just a wealth of story and history and perspective and philosophy. And there's so much richness that comes from a life filled with reading.
So I'm a junior at Hillsdale College, and I came in to their Western Heritage and English Great Books courses, and I had read probably 70% of what we had read in those classes. And my teachers were all very impressed, and they said, we have a lot of students coming to us saying that we've mastered these texts already in high school. Why are we reading them again? and they asked me, why do you feel like it's necessary to read them again? And I said that in my high school, I got the opportunity to be introduced to great authors and become familiarized with these conversations. And the idea that I could have a familiarity with what Kant is saying versus what John Locke is saying. And so introduced to these authors and then have the opportunity to know that any great book is worth rereading and rereading and rereading. And so now my understanding is formed in a different way. And it caused me to come to the text with a humility, knowing that I'd read these before and I could keep rereading them every year of my life and still get a better understanding. I think that reading the more difficult texts of literature is both important and rewarding because an encounter with these truths from the author on a first-hand basis is an irreplaceable experience. Because encountering these texts on a first-hand experience provides you with an experience of these truths and ideas in a different way than a textbook could or a lesser work of literature could, because we believe that these authors are great because of the skill with which they express these truths. And something that is challenging isn't negative because it's challenging. It can reap greater fruits in the formation of your mind and in your education in later life because of the difficulty and challenge of encountering these texts.
I think having a basis of literature that we've shared certainly has given us a lot of richness to move forward and contemplate new ideas or encounter new ideas together, because we've had a basis that we know from the past, and that we've taken the time to consider these things and developed a habit of speaking about them together. So we have a shared language, a shared history, a shared literature history, as well as developing those tools and those the muscles in your mind to read and consider and evaluate and then connect it to everything else you've read. So every time you encounter a new situation or a new book or a new sermon, we already have the habit of discussing it together, and which has led to a lot of conclusions.
Look, there's a long tradition and a strong and important one in education that you have a shared canon, or that you're reading from the same bookshelf, not because you want the same thoughts, but that you have common ground or an understanding with your companion or with your workers, with your fellow students or scholars. There's no discussion without at least some common basis. And in the Western world, those would be the great books.
One of the important things about reading more difficult, more condensed books is that it makes education less scary. A lot of times you see it's easy to embrace certain ideas or certain books because they're expressed in ways that are really difficult and therefore they must be true, or to listen to people telling you things and they're saying it in a very intelligent way, therefore it must be true. But going through this 5 years, a big variety of very difficult books sometimes gives you a better picture, I think, of philosophy as something. It's just a lot of valuable people trying to make sense of the world, no matter how hard the books themselves are. Yeah, one thing I did notice about college is that there's a lot of people in the world who are very concerned with doing well in education, but not too many people who are very interested in learning. That's one thing I think the Great Books program did for me, was taught me the importance of learning not just information that will help me get a better job, but just knowledge of the world in general and how beautiful the world is. Just one thing about GBT, I guess, is it's not just for the English majors and philosophy majors of the world. Learning from the great books and the classics is something that grows you as a person, whether you become philosophy minor, English major, or a bioengineering major in the future. So great books is for everyone.
One of the texts I remember at the time having a huge impact on me was St. Thomas Aquinas' On Nature and Grace. We'd already read several theologians up to that point, Anselm, Augustine, all of the A's, and they were fascinating, and I loved the way that Athanasius explained how the incarnation worked. But Thomas Aquinas, for one thing, he was so logical. It was so easy to follow what he was saying. but then some of what he had to say about how human nature, even though fallen, is still made in the image of God, and the way that we can be redeemed by grace and remade into who God originally created us to be, that really struck a chord with me at the time. So his content in that sense was phenomenal, but at the same time, his structure and the way he approached everything so systematically, that had a big impact on me in the way that I went forward from there, thinking about how I could know what I believed was true.
The first philosopher that I read in the Great Books program was Plato's Socratic Dialogues. And they say that all of Western philosophy is just footnotes in Plato. I think that's because Socrates asked a lot of questions. He had some thoughts, some answers to those questions, but they weren't final answers. Because I think the real gift that Socrates gave philosophy was the process of asking questions about our experience in life, hard questions, coming up with an answer, and then asking questions about the answer. And seeing him apply this process of inquiry to the men of Athens, and how frustrating it was to the people that were being interviewed, because they realized that they thought they had beliefs and opinions and they were really strongly held, but the foundations of those beliefs were really weak. And Socrates sort of encouraging them to have more rigorous answers, and the power of questions was really big. I was 12 at the time, and I'd never really been asked deep questions, and so I felt for the first time I was sort of waking up to reality and saying, okay, why am I here? Why do I believe this? Why do they believe that? Why is this the way it is? And that stuck with me.
Well, when I read Anselm, I believe I was 15, and previously we had read Greek philosophers who to some degree were in love with the truth, and that's a very beautiful thing, but it's still an abstraction. And Anselm was in love with a very specific God, and he was applying the full force of his truly momentous intellect on proving God, and proving that God is a Trinity, and proving that the Incarnation was necessary, and these very basic tenets of belief, which I had always clung to somewhat automatically. But Anselm was just, it wasn't as though he was fighting for it, but it was a passion of engagement that was like a fight. And he just, everything in him, all of the emotion, all of the mental capacity was fully directed towards God. And when you read at the end of the Proslogion, where he's like, let me love you in seeking, and seek you in loving, and let me find you in knowing, and know you in finding, and he's just passing back and forth these beautiful phrases, and at first it's an overwhelming torrent of loveliness, and it almost doesn't seem as though it means anything at first, and then you delve into it, and each clause you can pare it down. Each clause is this wonderful heaping up of meaning. It's the kind of culmination of his whole process of thought and existence, struggling with his own faith. So what I learned from Anselm was that kind of tenacity of love, that you can engage your whole intellect with a thing, and that's a way of having faith in it.
My favorite book, or the book that was most important to my personal growth that I read during GBT, was War and Peace. Natasha was a huge literary moment for me, and I went on to be an English major and to analyze characters, and she was a character who I did not at first like, and it was one of the first major examples to me of not necessarily having to find characters in literature likable, and they don't necessarily have to be people you would want to be friends with. It's not necessarily what literature's for. It's not about amusement or entertainment necessarily, that we were able to see her both as sort of a real person with a soul, and I think Dostoevsky's always very good at that, but also she was able to be both a character and a symbol, sort of innocence or hopefulness or vulnerability, all in ways that I think don't get displayed by female characters very often in literature.
And I think being able to respect that, even if I didn't find her likable at the time, was sort of a stretch of my ability to understand and have sort of empathy and for characters, for literature in general, and also the sort of ability to take it seriously in a way I hadn't before. When we're younger, it's definitely easy to try to look for characters who can be easily described, to sort of try to emulate them, who fit types. And that's true in the realm of gender, of like what does a good woman look like? It looks like this. And you sort of exemplify it in, a few female characters who are models of good behavior. And it doesn't only apply to gender. We all sort of want to do that. When we're younger, we want definitions to be easy, examples to be easy. I don't think that's necessarily what literature tries to do. I don't think that's what the Russian authors we studied in particular were exemplifying. I think that sort of literature both shows us what we are and what we can be, and none of it is particularly simple.
Well, there have been several of the great books that have really influenced and affected me over the years. There are two in particular that really challenged me. The first is Confessions by St. Augustine. Just seeing him through his writing really struggle to overcome temptation, and showing his cries out to the Lord in both times of despair and times of praise. And then those same mountaintops and those valleys of life are described so explicitly by Pascal in his Pensées about the greatness and the wretchedness of man, both the image of God that still remains in him and his fallen nature since.
I would have to say that my study of Euclid's Elements really helped me to appreciate the beauty of mathematics, as well as its order. Throughout the Elements, Euclid focuses on the logical deduction of proof through different step-by-step procedures. Where this is a facet of mathematics that is for the most part lost among our society, except in certain fields of science or mathematics, where you have to use proofs in order to make claims or theories. But mathematics today is primarily viewed as a means of solving problems. 1 + 1 = 2, or 5 × 5 = 25, or how long will it take so-and-so to get to the nearest distance about 8 miles from here, going at this speed. The idea of problem solving. Mathematics is typically used in that fashion, but rarely is it appreciated as a beauty in and of itself.
At the time, it was not my favorite class, I will admit that. I was always terrified that I'd get called on to give a proof and I would mess it up royally, so that panic would always arise in me. But now looking back on it, I realized just how much I now know about logic and about forming arguments and getting from these assumptions to this conclusion, and how to get from point A to point F, step by step. I know how to evaluate something and say, I don't think this is valid because this assumption is wrong. So it's, looking back on it retrospectively, it had a huge impact on the way that I think and the way I process when I know.
I remember learning geometry through Euclid's Elements, and he wrote something like a dozen books. In the class we had to take each proof that he had for a geometric proposition and validate it and recreate his argument for why things are the way they are. What was so amazing is that he started from just a very small set of definitions and assumptions. I remember very little of the geometry 10 years later, but what really impressed me was his scientific method, or his mathematical method, if you will. It also is true in philosophy, how all of us are able to build our belief structures from just a few assumptions, and those assumptions are powerful. Those definitions are powerful. Where we start from often determines what we can build with and where we end up.
I think through studying Euclid in the first year of Great Books and seeing him logically work through proofs really equipped me for the next 4 years of discussion and equipped me for really life in general, because so many of the philosophers and the authors base their arguments on logic and working step by step and backing up the things they have to say, improving their points, so that at the end of a conclusion, when you come to it, you can see how they've gotten there. And maybe you don't entirely agree with what they have to say, but you can see how they got there and see what steps they took and the route that they went, and then as a result, how that affects you and how that affects the world that you now live in.
Well, I was a very quiet child, and I really didn't want to start Great Books, but my parents felt that it was a very good thing for me, so I started, and I was so terribly intimidated, and it was so frightening, and there was a whole classroom of people who were listening to what I was saying, and I don't know, I feel like in general, Great Books, over the process of it, I got a voice from it, because one of the things that high schoolers especially struggle with, I feel, is realizing that it's really hard to say anything worthwhile, and if you do have some kind of self-awareness, you come to realize that the things coming out of your mouth are pretty silly most of the time. And part of that high school angst is just, why am I here? What am I saying? What's going on? Where is the meaning? And one of the most beautiful things that happened to me in Great Books was that I could be articulating the views of an author who had moved me, or who had not moved me, who I just thought was cool and interesting and strange and from far off past and exotic for that reason. But for whatever reason, I could articulate what they had said, and in doing so, bring meaning to my own life and give shape to my own soul. And it's people talk a lot about self-expression, how important it is to make sure that what you are is out there. And what I found was that you just aren't much of anyone when you start out, and if you soak yourself in these great epics, ultimately what you end up having is a meaning and a fullness to be able to give out. So I started out as a 12-year-old with not much to say and scared of my own voice, and ended up now I'm in grad school at New St. Andrews College, and I'm a teacher, and I teach rhetoric, and I try to give other kids their voice and help them to be formed by these same patterns and these same ideas.
I think it's important to consider, starting at a young age, but especially through the adolescence, adult ideas. What is the purpose of our life, and how to achieve that?
So when you reach 30, you aren't suddenly trying to figure out what is the purpose of my life. And you've never considered that before, or you've never even considered that there could be different possibilities than what you've already thought.
Yeah, I fly with a lot of people who finish their secondary education and they studied a trade, and now they're working, and there's a sort of vacancy to their life because now they've arrived, they have a job, a profession, they have leisure time, but I mean, what do you do?
What do you do with that?
What do you do with that? Or how do you encounter a challenge at work? The university system, especially if you pursue a technical field, doesn't offer a very engaged debate or even historical look back at the question of why, for what. And to begin that discussion early, when you've got, I guess, a lot more energy and time to consider that is very important.
Well, what I found with the Great Books tutorial is that it exposes you to so many ideas that you're going to encounter them in life, and to be able to be exposed to some pretty heavy concepts in the classroom where you can discuss it and talk about it rather than just being thrown into it in your daily life was extremely valuable. To have already been presented with and thought through ideas, incredibly valuable in my life, in that being able to get together and interact with people who you have this common intellectual ground with was incredibly valuable to me. Just being able to converse with people who are thinking at an extremely high level and very, able to have a discussion with somebody that's far beyond just the surface, hello, how are you kind of conversation.
I think wisdom ultimately is seeing things as God sees them, and God gives us glimpses of it throughout history. Aristotle, one of the most prominent philosophers, described practical wisdom as sort of knowing the right thing to do at the right time, at the right place, for the right reason. And we as people can really only know all of that when we are given foresight by God, because only He can see the full picture. And we're able to really see wisdom in other people, in those who live consistently with the truths of Scripture, those who overcome temptations and endure trials, those who accept criticism and learn from their mistakes, those who choose to live well in both the public eye and in the privacy of their home, who live well on the stage in front of thousands of people as we walk about our daily lives, and who live well behind the curtain where no one else can see. And I think through the great books, God's given us the opportunity to learn from the mistakes and the trials and the triumphs and the wisdom of others, so that we can choose to live well and better for doing so. I think the great books have so influenced our current culture, and to really understand who we are today, we have to understand our past. Just as in order to understand the current ideas, the current discussions, we have to understand the roots that really grew into the flowers that are blooming today. And since there's also just nothing new under the sun, we, through reading these books, can learn from their experiences and learn from their understandings. And so those enable us to live well in the present and to prepare for the future. I think the great books also remind us of just the vast amount of knowledge that lies beyond ourselves. And it humbles us to the fact that, like Isaac Newton, we can say, if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants.
One of the things that I love about GBT is the conversations that we get to have, whether that's through class discussions or getting to know my classmates better. There's always a unique depth to our dialogue. We get to deliberate the hard questions that we find in our readings, and I love how Mr. Hendricks never gives us the correct textbook answer. Instead, we're all engaging in a discussion to deduce the most logical Christian position to take on a particular issue. Mr. Hendricks is really our tour guide, not our teacher, and is leading us on a journey filled with literary and spiritual beauty. Our destination is truth, and by becoming better philosophers, we're really becoming better lovers of Christ.
What GBT did for our kids was it taught them how to think critically, whereas in the school system, the kids are taught something and they are basically given the answer to the question and then to repeat that answer during a test. Whereas GBT, it's never like that. The question is asked, the answer is never given, because the answer is the child has to come up with an answer, and that makes sense to him and to the instructor based on what they were talking about, but the answer is never given. The answer is asked little by little and prodded with different angles so that the student can understand what they should really be thinking.
The real gift that Socrates gave philosophy was the process of asking questions about our experience in life, hard questions, coming up with an answer, and then asking questions about the answer. Why do you believe this? Oh, really? Okay, why do you believe that? And seeing him apply this process of inquiry to the men of Athens, and and how frustrating it was to the people that were being interviewed, because they realized that they thought they had beliefs and opinions and they were really strongly held, but the foundations of those beliefs were really weak. And Socrates sort of encouraging them to have more rigorous answers, and the power of questions was really big. I was 12 at the time, and I'd never really been asked deep questions, and so I felt for the first time I was sort of waking up to reality and saying, okay, why am I here? Why do I believe this? Why do they believe that? Why is this the way it is? And that stuck with me.
I think that ETS is uniquely suited in its formation towards forming the mind and understanding of a student in high school. And so the first 1 to 2 years that are more lecture based, and then moving into a more conversationally formatted classroom first prepares the student in this context of great ideas and understanding, and the lectures help give a context for what you're doing with each text. And then Ms. Hendricks asks really excellent questions that spur you on to harder thoughts about the text. And then in year 3, when we transition into a more explicitly conversational format, we stop raising hands. It's just a very organic conversation. You have the chance to grapple with the ideas rather than write down answers on a test, because honestly, a test format of saying, what does Augustine say in his Confessions isn't going to be the same thing as having a conversation about what he's trying to say. It gives you a deeper understanding.
I like great books because in the conventional high school approach, the focus is on what to think, not how to think. In GBT, the emphasis is on developing a skill set of analyzing the people and places around you and coming to a reasoned conclusion as to how they impact the world, how they have impacted the world, and how they impact the decisions that you will make in your life.
I appreciate the world of ETS in that we work really hard coming together in class and discussing ideas, but then beyond that, we come together to celebrate life in music and dancing and just the better things of life all together. And it's a peaceful, exhilarating, and enriching experience at all times.
There is a photograph of us with 3, actually. Myself, I think Caleb Davenport, and yourself racing at Olympus. We had organized a little foot race along the regional Olympic
Because what else would you do in Olympia?
And I have a competitive nature, but such things are enhanced when you're trying to impress someone. And apparently you were already standing at the finish line watching me and Kayla crossing a piece of marble down there, and you're in the background looking at us. I
was impressed. It's true.
I can't remember who won that race.
I did.
By
and
a lot.
I have the photograph.
we got a photo down the line, so we got him. I think you're a stride ahead of him.
One that's just been enormous is what you see behind me, and the community, and the fact that these girls get to come and have a bunch of friends who dialogue on great ideas, that have fun in that kind of environment, that have monthly dances, that interact on ideas and great concepts, has just been enormous in terms of that sense of community.
One thing I cherish actually the most about GBT is the culture that the Hendricks family have created here. I mean, it's amazing to come into a space and have a place that's pure and wholesome and just a platform for you to learn and grow and develop relationships with other people who are also equally eager to learn and grow. And to see the families where it's not just the students, but it's the parents and the grandparents and the younger siblings and the balls. I loved the Christmas and the summer balls. And the friendships that I have made, I think, are very special in the fact that I don't just happen to know an individual, but I know a family and I know their story. And I still know and cherish all of the relationships that I've developed, and I'm really grateful for that.
It's not just a class you're taking, it's also a community you can enter into, which as I've realized coming out, it will always be there for you. So if you still have your classmates that made it through 5 years, and even if they didn't make it through 5 years, you can find the ones that dropped out at 3 or dropped out at 2, and you run into them, or even went before you. So I was at my school, and this random person, I was talking about the great books and Aristotle, and he noticed the way I was talking about it, and he said, "Wait, did you take a great books class with Mr. Fritz Hendricks?" I said, "Yes, I did." And he was from North Carolina, and he was 2 years older than me, and we still could connect on that level.
Well, I did online great books for a while, and I loved that experience because it allowed me to have connection with people who maybe not just in Escondido, but across the globe as well. And I think it was really impactful to me to see people striving after wisdom everywhere, not just in our community, not just with a family, like with my family, but instead that it's a global thing that people are interested in. And I think also the social aspect, being in Escondido, being able to participate in events, being able to be with people and show up at an event, at a dance, but also have intellectual conversation at the same time is a really unique fusing of different worlds.
The great books began with reading the Iliad and the Odyssey. And you read about Achilles and Agamemnon in the Iliad. And years later, I started a business 10 years after I read the Iliad. And I remember thinking about what kind of CEO I wanted to be. I ended up raising several $1 million, building several products, managing up to 10 employees at one point. And these archetypes of Achilles and Agamemnon kept coming back to me. Achilles, the warrior who leads from the front line, sword in hand, hacking and slashing, the glorious fighter, the individual contributor. And that's totally a model of a certain type of CEO. The CEO who leads from the front, who's doing the big sales, who's closing the big accounts, who's raising the money, who's designing the product, who's kind of doing, leading by doing. And then Agamemnon, the master of the armies, the great commander-in-chief general, a totally different archetype of a totally different leader. An archetype of a leader who was a great manager, a great organizer, who, you know, whose role was to win by strategy as opposed to by his own sword. And I kept wrestling with which one I wanted to be, and ultimately I think just having that framework in my mind was very valuable, because I ended up being able to switch between modes. At times I recognized it was important to be more like Achilles and to do. Other times I realized it was important to let other people do, and to take a step back and be more high level. But this is just one example of the unexpected but really powerful ways in which ancient literature, history, philosophy, and science can come to you and give you a source of strength to draw on the people around you don't have. Makes you feel more grounded, makes you feel more prepared, makes you feel that whatever you're trying to accomplish, there's a long lineage of people who've wrestled with the questions you're wrestling with and who've done even greater things than you're attempting to do. I think business is so much a thinking man's game. You know, everything about business is philosophical on some level. Even just the question of delivering value. What is valuable? How do you even think about, you know, when somebody's willing to pay for something, why are they willing to pay for it? That's a philosophical question. So knowing how to think about philosophical questions is very valuable.
It's funny, I am in Hollywood now as a musician, but even in that career, I still find myself very blessed by the books I've read in GBT, the literature and the depth and the way, you know, even the plays that we read, the way that it was written and communicated in the language, and all of that, I think, has still been such a huge blessing to my life.
I'm a costume and scenic designer, and I appreciate having the this long and arduous sometimes history of reading through the great books, because it's given me a basis of understanding to start from in my designs even. So I know I can read through a play and pick out the themes much quicker, much easier. I enjoy doing that because I have the skills to do that. And then I'm able to interpret those or infuse those into the design of the play, which then it becomes such a richer experience for the audience member. Even if they don't necessarily pick up on that specifically intellectually, they'll get a feeling from the color palette I've chosen to represent the melancholy of the central character, or the other visual elements tie in to the intellectual ones in a way that makes a richer experience for viewing.
So I'm an engineer now. I work for Google, and although maybe like you look at what I do on a daily basis and it doesn't look like it applies directly to the liberal arts that I learned in great books in high school, it's, I think, really the benefit of great books to me was the wrestling of ideas and struggling through, like, how does this relate to that? And because a lot of what I do in software is wrestle with ideas and try to fit things together. You look at all these heavy ideas you have to deal with, and there's not a right answer. There's not, a lot of times, there's not a clear-cut, like, oh, this is exactly what it is. And people have their differing opinions, and that's what it's like that's what it's like a lot of times in the real world, where you're looking to solve some sort of problem, or you're looking through, how are we going to make this thing work? And if you're always trying to approximate something as finding the right answer, you're not going to be able to come up with a new and innovative kind of answer. Being able to clearly communicate and effectively communicate your ideas is important, particularly when you work across like time zones or things where you can't be present with someone. And being able to clearly express your ideas in paper also helps in formulating your ideas and being able to solidify them. Although I'm an engineer, I really consider myself an artist. And I think when you look at what an artist does, they don't just seek to approximate something. An artist knows what to include, what not to include, because they have explored a bunch of different things beyond what they're going to present as their art. And so when I look at engineering, it's that same sort of thing that applies, where because I've explored these ideas, because I've wrestled with them, I've become that much better of an engineer because I have this greater context for understanding things.
It was in the 5th year of my Great Books program where I found myself blessed with the opportunity to take a history of science and mathematics course with Mr. Hendricks. That this really struck home for me. There I came to realize that what we call science today not only had its birth from the natural philosophy of the 1800s, but that philosophy was and is a valid and needed means of exploring the natural world. Following the great minds of science through their own words, from Aristotle to Archimedes, to Pascal to Newton to Einstein, one is able to see how they learned to ask the right questions and devise methods of answering them, the strong influence of culture upon the leading minds of the day, and how one must always be analyzing their motivations and methods of inquiry with just as much care as their data. I will forever be indebted to Mr. Hendricks and his Great Books program for fostering in me a lifelong passion for truth and beauty. In the words of Aristotle, therefore the activity of God, which surpasses all others in blessedness, must be contemplative, and of human activities, therefore, that which is most akin to this must be most of the nature of happiness. Thank you.
In my 5th year of Great Books, I took a course on the history of science and mathematics. And one of the fascinating things I liked about that class was the Escher circles. How each circle was, each of these geometrical spheres and circles interwove together to create this beautiful piece of artistry. It was just quite fascinating just to see how the mathematics involved created beautiful artistry. Even in some of the Muslim Muslim art and architecture of the medieval period is because they did not focus on images, because they believed that images were a violation of the Quran, they used mathematical and geometrical shapes for their art and architecture. And you can see the beauty in that. Just to be appreciative of the beauty of mathematics. It's simply astounding.